Nobody cares. Get your overpriced coffee out of my American metal. I don't want it. And I'm tired.
Oh, hello there, metalheads of the internet, and welcome to the Metal Meltdown, I guess. I kind of think maybe you should come back later. Yeah, I think that's for the best. Thrash and Jackson has been ranting and raving for hours on end now.
I'm not ranting and raving, Mr. Meltdown. I'm telling the goddamn truth. The fact is, metal died in the 90s.
Oh god, not this tired argument again. Thrash and Jackson, metal didn't die in the 90s. There were tons of successful bands and albums and tons of new genres and subgenres. It didn't die in the 90s. It didn't die!
Yes, it did. It died a gruesome death at the hands of grunge and alternative rock and all these sad, sissy Seattle teenagers. You don't know what you're talking about, Mr. Meltdown. Never have known, never will know. I've been listening to metal since before you were born, and you weren't there. You weren't there. You don't know what it was like. None of y'all know what it was like. Consider yourself lucky. I spare you the horror of the knowledge of the things that we had to do to survive in those dark, horrible, depressing, dystopian days. Metal didn't just die, Mr. Meltdown. It was a bloodbath. It was a massacre. A massacre! They hunted us like dogs, like animals in the streets. Oh. They made us pledge allegiance to Kurt Cobain and his army of liberal losers. Oh!
Sweet Kentucky Fried Fuck, you are such a fucking drama queen. Pull yourself together, man. What are we doing? I am genuinely so sick and tired of this argument for a couple of different reasons. First off, because it's almost always coming from these old, fuddy-duddy, out-of-touch, delusional Gen X boomer metalheads and elitists and gatekeepers who, quite frankly, haven't enjoyed or even listened to anything new in 40 fucking years. These people simply cannot handle that the music and the metal of the 1980s, that the music that they loved, that the music that was very likely the soundtrack to their childhood, to their adolescence, to their 20s, is no longer the talk of the town, no longer the hot shit. They have made this music, loving this music, being a part of the 80s metal scene and vibe, their entire identity. They take it so seriously and so personally that anything and everything else and since is an attack, not just on metal, but on them. I also hate this argument because, guess what? It's objectively wrong. It just is. End of story. It's not just a bad take, it's also the wrong one. Now, is it fair to argue that maybe, just maybe, certain metal bands and genres did not fare as well in the 90s as they did in the 80s? Sure, that's fair. Is it also fair to argue that metal overall didn't have the same kind of sauce and impact in the 90s that it had in the 80s? Yeah, honestly, that's also fair. But to argue that metal in its entirety died in the 90s, or really at the hands of the 90s, it's just stupid. It's also wrong, and I'm going to prove it here today. We are going to look at every single major metal subgenre, or at least as many as we can cram into this video today, and we're really going to talk about why metal didn't die in the 90s, or at least why I believe it didn't die in the 90s. And we're gonna start with old school classic heavy metal. Alright, so I concede we're not off to a great start here. I think we can all agree that the 90s wasn't an especially awesome time for Black Sabbath and Judas Priest and Iron Maiden. But hear me out. Let me cook. The 90s weren't great for these bands because of grunge, because of alt-rock, because of the 90s. The 90s weren't great for these bands because by this point, they'd already been around for 20, 30 years or so, and there were cracks in the foundation that were becoming more and more visible and more difficult to quickly and easily repair. Internal struggles and relationship and personal problems, arguments over the creative direction of a band, friction between bandmates because they've known each other for so long and they're pissing each other off and they're absorbing each other into one another's fucking drama, resulting in lineup changes and mediocre material. That's what hurt these bands. Period. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't doubt that there are people who will come to the defense of records like Dehumanizer and Virtual 11 and Jugulator, but let's be honest here and let's look at the facts. These are not the band's most accomplished works. These are not being held in the same conversation as records like Master of Reality, The Number of the Beast, Screaming for Vengeance. They just aren't. They didn't sell as well. They didn't get that same kind of universal love and success and embrace. They just didn't. It's a fact, okay? But again, this just doesn't really, as far as I can see, have really anything to do with grunge or alt-rock. And it's worth noting that there were some old-school classic heavy metal bands that still enjoyed moderate amounts of critical and commercial success. Motorhead, for example, they trucked along pretty well in the 90s, you know? They released a few pretty solid records. They had a few hit singles here and there. And let's just be honest here, the 90s were a particularly awesome time for Ozzy Osbourne. He continued to release huge hit songs and records. No More Tears is still maybe his best solo album nearly 35 years later. And the double whammy of the Ozfest Heavy Metal Touring Festival and Ozzy reuniting with Black Sabbath in the late 90s is just fucking incredible. No classic heavy metal musician had it better in the 90s than Ozzy motherfucking Osbourne. Next up, thrash metal. Yeah, thrash metal had it pretty rough. I concede there. Many bands faced pressure from record companies to change with the times, and those who caved to that pressure faced extreme criticism from diehard fans, and those who didn't struggled big time and became irrelevant. That being said, it's worth acknowledging that despite the changes made to their sounds, be they genuine or not, and despite the reaction from diehard fans, bands like Metallica, Slayer, Megadeth, Sepultura remained extremely popular and successful. In fact, it's not unfair to argue that these bands in particular released some of their most iconic and influential material in the 90s. Like Sepultura, for instance, Arise, Chaos AD, Roots, Megadeth, Rust in Peace at the very beginning of the 90s, but nevertheless, Countdown to Extinction as well, Euthanasia, Slayer, maybe not so much. Might be a stretch there. But hey, they trucked on, they still did pretty well. And I mean, Metallica had the fucking Black Album, the best-selling metal album of all time. One of the best-selling albums in any genre whatsoever of all fucking time. It continues to sell 5,000 copies every single fucking week. And they're not the only ones. Bands like Testament, Creator, Anthrax, and Overkill also enjoyed varying degrees of commercial, critical, and creative success while experimenting with other genres and while also still staying pretty true to themselves. Like, sure, yeah, I get it. Maybe you don't love Diabolus and Musica, or I Hear Black, or Sounds of White Noise, and there's no rule saying that you have to, but I don't think the issue is necessarily that thrash metal died. The issue is more so that it was forced to change. Next up, groove metal. Pantera. Enough said. Hands down, one of the biggest, most influential, popular metal bands of the 1990s. Tons of hit songs and records. Cowboys from Hell, vulgar display of power, far beyond driven. Their massive success and unique sound inspired or forced many to go groove metal in the 90s, including some of the thrash bands that we just mentioned. And they're not the only ones. I mean, I don't think it's a hot take at this point to say that before Pantera, Exhorder was laying down the foundation for groove metal. Not to mention there was Machine Head, White Zombie, Prong, who all enjoyed a decent amount of critical, commercial, and creative success in this time, who all contributed to groove metal, to the health and well-being of metal in the 90s. Next up, death metal. Not only did death metal not die in the 90s, but frankly, it thrived and expanded exponentially. Though there were some bands like Possessed, Morbid Angel, Autopsy, and Death that had already released some pretty influential and legendary stuff by the very end of the 80s, there was undeniably an explosion of bands throughout the following decade that paves the way for multiple classic records and new subgenres of death metal. Bands all over the world were pushing themselves to new extremes constantly. In America, you had Cannibal Corpse, Suffocation, Obituary, Deicide, the aforementioned Morbid Angel, and Death, all releasing extremely heavy, provocative, brutal, influential music. Death in particular eventually became pioneers of new subgenres like technical and progressive death metal because of records like Spiritual Healing, Human, Individual Thought Patterns, and they did this alongside bands like Cynic and Atheist. Things were just as crazy over in Sweden. By the mid-90s, bands like Entombed, Grave, Dismember, and At the Gates had released tons of great records and paved a foundation for melodic death metal, which in turn gave rise to bands like In Flames, Arch Enemy, Dark Tranquillity, Amon Amarth. English grindcore bands like Napalm Death and Carcass turned to death metal in this time as well, releasing iconic records like Harmony Corruption and Heartwork, contributing to genres like death grind, death and roll, the aforementioned melodic death metal. And hey, don't forget Canada. You like brutal death metal? You have None So Vile from Cryptopsy to thank, in part, for that. You like avant-garde death metal? You have Obscura from Gorguts, in part, to thank for that. Next up, black metal. Much like death metal, black metal thrived and expanded exponentially in the 90s. The Norwegian second wave black metal movement took everything established by first wave bands like Venom, Celtic Frost, and Bathory and Merciful Fate and went into much darker territory, resulting in massive underground momentum and a slew of classic records. Now granted, a lot of it was propelled by controversy, church burnings, and weird underground cults, and neo-Nazis, and murders, and then, you know, I concede controversy and scandal and outrage definitely played a role here. But that doesn't make records from Mayhem, Burzum, Darkthrone, Immortal, Emperor, and Enslaved any less influential and important to the development and continued popularity of black metal. Hell, some of my all-time favorite black metal records were released in this time from some of these bands like the aforementioned Enslaved and Emperor, with Frost and To the Welkins at Dusk respectively, Windear as well, Ulver. And whatever changes may have been made to these bands and their music and their image over time, from my perspective, has been mostly pretty genuine, clearly motivated by a desire for that change rather than by some kind of outside intervention or pressure from a record company or some kind of like other music scene or whatever else have you. And this wasn't just happening in Norway. Countries like France, Sweden, Finland, and the United States were also developing strong underground black metal scenes. And like in this same time too, in the UK, you had Cradle of Filth. In Poland, you had Behemoth. In Japan, you had Psy. Next up, doom metal. If you loved it sad and slow, the 90s were a great time for you. Various subgenres of doom and various genres inspired by doom and slower, moodier textures and atmospheres popped up throughout the decade, and all of them thrived. Like Death Doom and Gothic Doom metal gave us bands like Paradise Lost, My Dying Bride, Anathema. There was also Typo Negative, who achieved genuine mainstream success with records like Bloody Kisses and October Rust, despite edgy, controversial, off-putting rhetoric and Jokes from Peter Steele. Stoner Doom gave us Sleep and Electric Wizard. Funeral Doom gave us Evoken and Mournful Congregation. There was also sludge metal, which is kind of adjacent to Doom in a way, which gave us I Hate God and Acid Bath and Crowbar. And though classic doom metal wasn't as popular in this time, the likes of Trouble, Cathedral, and St. Vitus consistently released pretty solid stuff. Next up, alternative metal. Alternative metal's close ties to alternative rock did the genre many favors, and allowed many alt-grunge and metal bands to coexist peacefully for a time. Bands like Faith No More, Alice in Chains, Rage Against the Machine, Jane's Addiction, and Tool all released iconic material and sold tons of records. Alternative metal also paved the way for nu metal, perhaps the most important metal creation of the 90s outside of Pantera and groove metal. The more introspective and dour and angsty vibes of Korn, Deftones, and Slipknot was metal's true answer to grunge, and filled the void left by grunge in the late 90s quite nicely, eventually achieving genuine mainstream success in the late 90s all the way into the early 2000s. And nu metal's impact on metal and on rock music really can still be felt today, as many bands have been influenced by nu metal in some capacity. And finally, glam metal. Okay, you win. Glam metal died. Straight up. The flashy, racy, sexy, poppy hooks and vibes and glamorous looks and party attitudes of bands like Motley Crue, Poison, Rat, Cinderella, and more just wasn't tolerated at all by a new and young audience enamored by angsty, dour, introspective, and gritty grunge and alternative rock. They just hated it so much. Many glam metal bands disbanded. Those that survived released mediocre material, went through several lineup changes, and became irrelevant to an almost laughably embarrassing extent. Some tried to adapt, but failed miserably. Glam metal was hit so hard, and to be honest, it never really recovered. Years later, many of these bands are inactive or irrelevant. They simply aren't able to evolve or adapt or change with the times. And that's because glam metal very much is a product of its time. The genre is so dead that the genre's most popular and relevant band at this moment is literally a comedy metal band, Steel Panther, a parody band that's been around for nearly 20 years and has recycled the same riffs and jokes so many times that they've become a caricature of the very thing they claimed to be honoring and satirizing. The only exception I can really think of is maybe Bon Jovi, who has remained relevant and successful not just past the 80s, but also past the 90s. He's got a ton of hit singles and records. And there's also bands like Def Leppard and Scorpions and Whitesnake who weren't full-blown glam metal, but they were adjacent to it. They may have indulged in it at certain parts. They've also remained mostly pretty successful. But the glam metal bands, the aforementioned Motley Crue and Poisons of the world, they've had it rough. Glam metal is dead.
That's an awful nice argument you got there, Mr. Meltdown. Only one problem, though. Nobody cares. Because glam metal sucks. It's garbage. We all know it. It's gay. It's stupid. It's dumb. It was made for girls and gays and people who don't know jack shit about metal. Like you. I mean, honestly, who gives a crap? If you gotta wear makeup and some silly costume to sell a song, then maybe your song wasn't all that good to begin with. Ever think about that? Mr. Meltdown? Huh?
What about Pantera? They had a glam phase.
You shut your goddamn mouth. Right now, Mr. Meltdown.
They did, though. So did Ozzy Osbourne, Celtic Frost, Judas Priest, and Lord knows Venom was always wandering around in makeup and silly costumes.
I mean it. Stop it. Don't do it. Don't say it.
You know who else wore makeup and had silly costumes for a brief period? Slayer.
No!
Would you look at that? It's almost as if the issue was never that metal died in the 90s, but rather that metal changed. And some of you, like that motherfucker, can't handle change. Everything has to look and sound and be a very specific way, otherwise it's not metal. At least not according to you. And you built your entire life, your entire personality upon being metal 24/7. Who'da thunk it, huh? Who'da thunk it? I did. I thunk it. I thunk it up. You're welcome. You're so welcome. Subscribe. Other videos. Cope, Steve, cry, bitch, moan. Like him. I'd have thunk it.